The summer of 2016 had been a season Claire Hartman's parents believed would change her life. 14 years old, born blind, she had always navigated the world through sound. Her fingers knew the shape of a violin before most children learned the alphabet. She could tune by ear in seconds, hear a wrong note from across the room, and play pieces so cleanly that even seasoned musicians forgot she couldn't see the sheet music in front of her. That summer, she was accepted into an exclusive music camp tucked deep into the Adirondacks, a place where prodigies came to refine their skills and immerse themselves in long days of rehearsal, theory lessons, and small ensemble performances. The camp was quiet, isolated, and surrounded by dense forest. It sat beside a lake so still it mirrored the sky, broken only by the splash of a fish or the echo of a distant canoe paddle. There was no cell service, no traffic noise, and for many parents, that was a selling point, a safe, distraction-free haven for their children to focus solely on their craft. For Claire, it was also the first time she would be away from her family for more than a few days. Her parents were nervous, but she wasn't. She told them she wanted to prove she could be independent, that she could find her own way even in unfamiliar places. From the first day, Claire made an impression. She had a quiet presence but a confidence that drew others in. Counselors noticed how she navigated the camp without hesitation, memorizing the distance between the dining hall and the music rooms after only a few walks. Her cabin mates would watch her tilt her head slightly when someone spoke, the smallest smile on her face as though she were hearing more than just words. And when she played, the camp seemed to pause. Fellow students, some much older, would lean against the door frames to listen. Her performances didn't just have technical perfection, they had something harder to explain, something that felt personal. As the first week passed, Claire's schedule was full. Her days began with group rehearsals in the main hall and ended with long, solitary practice sessions. It wasn't unusual for her to linger after others left, running through a difficult passage again and again until she was satisfied. Counselors would sometimes have to gently remind her it was late. She always promised she was heading straight back to her cabin. On the evening of July the 14th, the air was warm and still. Dinner had ended, and the last light was slipping through the trees. Claire finished a rehearsal with her small ensemble and decided to stay behind for a bit more practice. The music hall had a soft, muffled quiet after dark, the kind that made her feel alone but never lonely. She worked through a new piece until she felt the shape of it settle in her memory, then packed her violin carefully into its case. Witnesses recall seeing her leave the hall around 9:30 p.m., walking down the gravel path toward her. Cabin. Somewhere along that short walk, something changed. The path was familiar to her by then, only a few minutes long. It wound between tall pines before splitting into smaller trails that led to the different cabins. She had walked it dozens of times in the daylight and at night. No one remembers seeing her after that moment. She never reached her cabin. By morning, the absence was impossible to ignore. Her bed was neatly made, her duffel bag untouched. Her violin case was not in the room. At first, staff thought she might have gone to the dining hall early or gotten an early start on practice. But as they checked the music hall, the paths, and finally the surrounding woods, unease began to spread. By mid-morning, they knew something was wrong. Counselors called her name over and over, their voices carrying across the lake. No answer came. State police arrived quickly. They learned she had been last seen walking alone, carrying her violin. Search teams spread out, combing the trails and shoreline. The forest was vast, the ground uneven, and without clear landmarks, it was easy to become disoriented. But Claire wasn't like most lost hikers. She relied on sound, on familiar steps, on the subtle cues of the world around her. Investigators struggled to imagine how she could have simply vanished in a place she'd already mastered. The first day ended without a single trace. The lake was calm, the forest offered nothing, and the camp, a place built for music and safety, was now the center of something unthinkable. Even before the official search ramped up, there was an unspoken fear shared by the staff, the campers, and the few locals who'd come to help. In a place this small, someone should have seen something, but no one had. And as the sun set again over the water, the question hanging in the air was one no one wanted to say aloud. If Claire hadn't gotten lost, then what had happened between the music hall and her cabin that night? The first hours after Claire's disappearance were filled with a kind of chaos the camp had never experienced. At sunrise, her absence was confirmed, and counselors moved quickly to check every cabin, every practice room, every corner of the grounds where she might have gone. Other campers were quietly pulled aside and questioned. A few remembered hearing her leave the music hall the night before. None saw her arrive back at her cabin. By mid-morning, the camp director had called the state police. The remote setting meant it took some time for them to arrive, but once they did, they treated the situation with immediate seriousness. For a blind teenager to vanish in such a short window of time was alarming, and the possibilities were limited. Either she had somehow gotten lost or injured in the dark, or she had been taken somewhere she could not call for help. Counselors and fellow students formed search lines that morning, fanning out into the woods. They called her name again and again, listening for the smallest sound in return. The forest swallowed most of it, the dense trees dampening voices after just a short distance. Volunteers waded through underbrush, checked along the narrow shoreline of the lake, and scanned the camp's open fields. The stillness of the area felt oppressive, and more than one person commented later that it seemed as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Within hours, search dogs were brought in. The handlers started them near the music hall, where Claire had last been seen, and let them work their way down the gravel path toward the cabins. At first, the dogs seemed confident, following the route she would have taken home. Then, about 200 yards from the building, just before the trail split, the dogs veered toward a narrow gap between trees that led to the service road. This road was used only by staff for supply deliveries and maintenance runs. Campers were told not to go near it. The dogs followed her scent down that hidden track, noses low, tails stiff, until they reached the edge of the road. And then, abruptly, they stopped. The scent trail was gone, as though whatever trace of her had been there simply ended. Handlers tried circling the area, bringing the dogs back to the point several times, but each time they returned with the same result. Her trail ended at the asphalt. It was while searching the brush nearby that an officer spotted something resting in the shadow of a rotting log, a black hard-shell violin case. It was closed, the clasps fastened, but it was lighter than it should have been. When opened, it was empty. Her bow and instrument were gone. The interior lining was clean, with no signs of struggle or damage, but the absence of the violin was chilling. Investigators gathered the case carefully and began photographing the surrounding ground. There were no clear footprints, no tire marks that could be distinguished from old ones, and no personal items scattered around. To the police, this suggested that if Claire had been here, she either left willingly with someone or was removed quickly, leaving no time for belongings to be dropped or for a struggle to disturb the dirt. Back at camp, officers began to quietly piece together the possibilities. One was that Claire had grown disoriented in the dark and wandered toward the road. But for someone who navigated primarily through sound and touch, it was odd that she would stray from a familiar route without a clear reason. The other, far darker possibility was that someone had met her along that path, someone she may have trusted enough to follow, and led her toward the road where a vehicle could have been waiting. By late afternoon, the search perimeter expanded beyond the camp's property lines. Patrol cars cruised the rural roads, stopping to question anyone out walking or driving. Troopers knocked on the doors of nearby homes, asking if anyone had seen a young girl with long brown hair, a white cane, and a violin the night before. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched over the forest floor, the officers knew they were racing against time. Every missing person's case carried a clock, and the first 24 hours were critical. Yet with no tracks to follow, no eyewitness to place her past the road, and the haunting image of her empty case burned into everyone's mind, the question became harder to ignore. Had Claire simply lost her way, or had someone made sure she would never reach her cabin again? The music hall at the camp was more than just a rehearsal space. It was the heart of the property, a wide, high-ceilinged building with warped wooden floors, rows of mismatched chairs, and heavy curtains that dulled the echoes of even the loudest performances. For most campers, it was where the day began and ended. For Claire, It was a second home. She'd often stay after the others had gone, her violin filling the hall with runs and passages she wanted to perfect. 2 days after she vanished, detectives began a slow, methodical sweep of the building. They started with the stage and worked outward, checking under risers, behind the thick curtains, and in the narrow storage closets where old instruments and folding music stands were kept. The goal wasn't just to find something belonging to her. It was to piece together her final moments there. Near the second row of chairs, beneath one that was slightly pulled out of line, a deputy spotted a small, curled piece of paper. At first, it seemed unremarkable, but as he unfolded it, the texture was unmistakable. Raised dots pressed into thick, slightly yellowed paper. It was one of Claire's Braille music sheets. It was damp in patches, smudged with dirt as though it had been dropped on the ground and picked up later. The edges were crumpled as if it had been handled roughly. Counselors confirmed it belonged to her. She'd brought a small stack of Braille sheets from home, each one labeled in the corner with a tactile sticker so she could identify the piece. That discovery raised more questions than it answered. The page was from a piece she'd been working on during her last rehearsal. But why would it be under a chair? And why was it damp? Investigators considered whether she might have dropped it accidentally on her way out, but its location, pushed far beneath the chair's legs, made that unlikely. Attention then shifted to the camp's modest security system. The music hall had 2 monitored entrances, the front doors, which campers used, and a heavy steel back door that opened onto a service path leading toward the woods. The building's electronic access log showed something strange. At 11:43 p.m., long after lights out, that back door had been opened. No staff member had signed it out. There was no reason for anyone to be in the hall at that hour. The door had no exterior camera, but the internal sensor was clear. It had been used. Whether it was opened from the inside or outside couldn't be determined from the log alone. Detectives wondered if someone had entered the building to meet Claire, or if she had left through it willingly. As they reconstructed the timeline, they spoke with every staff member on duty that night. Most had been in their cabins, asleep or preparing for the next day. But one counselor, who lived in a small staff unit not far from the lake, recalled something unsettling. Sometime after midnight, he had stepped outside to get a drink of water from the communal kitchen. In the quiet of the night, he heard faint violin music drifting through the trees. At first, he assumed it was Claire. She was known for practicing late. But the sound wasn't right. The notes were halting, uneven, as if the player was unfamiliar with the instrument or struggling to remember the melody. He listened for a few minutes, trying to place the direction. It wasn't coming from the music hall. It was further out, somewhere beyond the camp's main paths. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the music stopped. He thought little of it at the time. Unusual, yes, but not alarming. Only after her disappearance did the memory weigh heavily on him. Detectives couldn't ignore the implication. If the counselor's memory was accurate, someone had been playing a violin, possibly Claire's, in the woods in the early hours of the morning. Combined with the unexplained back door entry and the discovery of her crumpled music sheet, it suggested movement after she left the hall. The working theories split in two. Either she had been persuaded or coerced into leaving through that back door to a secluded meeting spot, or someone had taken her instrument and left behind small, deliberate traces to confuse the timeline. Both possibilities pointed to the same chilling reality. Whatever happened to Claire did not occur by accident, and somewhere in that night's silence, the trail began to slip beyond the camp's reach. As investigators dug deeper into the events surrounding Claire's disappearance, their focus inevitably shifted to the people who had been closest to her during her time at camp, the staff. On paper, the camp employed a small, tight-knit group: music instructors, counselors, kitchen workers, maintenance staff, and seasonal hires brought on for the summer rush. In practice, the environment was more fractured. Interviews revealed that beneath the surface of shared responsibility, tensions and personal grievances had been brewing all season. One name immediately stood out: a maintenance worker who had been at the camp for just under 3 weeks. He was described by others as quiet, often keeping to himself, but he had been seen talking casually with some campers, including Claire, while repairing steps near the music hall earlier in the summer. The most troubling detail was his sudden departure. On the morning after Claire vanished before the official police search had even reached full scale, he was gone. According to payroll records, he told the camp's front office that a family emergency required him to leave immediately. No one recalled seeing him pack, and the cabin he stayed in appeared hastily vacated, the bed unmade, a few tools left behind. When police reached out to him, he claimed he had traveled back to his hometown several states away that same morning. His alibi was thin. He said he'd been at home with his brother the night Claire disappeared, but no transportation records confirmed when he left, and no one could definitively place him outside camp during the critical hours. Then, there was the issue of one of the counselors, a man in his late 20s who had been with the camp for multiple summers. Earlier that year, he had been formally reprimanded after another staff member reported that he was spending extended periods alone with younger students under the pretense of mentorship. While no direct accusations of misconduct had been made, the camp director had issued a warning instructing him to keep all interactions within group settings. He denied doing anything inappropriate and insisted his focus was on fostering musical talent. Still, his name remained in the police notes, his movements the night of Claire's disappearance under scrutiny. When alibis were checked, the picture became murkier. The maintenance worker was unaccounted for during the late-night hours, and the reprimanded counselor claimed he had been in his cabin asleep, but no one could confirm seeing him there. Other staff members admitted that after curfew, supervision was loose. Some stayed in their quarters, others lingered in the common areas or slipped out for late walks. The lack of structure after dark meant that tracking anyone's exact whereabouts was almost impossible. As the investigation pressed on, word of these internal issues began to leak, and with it came a wave of panic from parents. Within days, they started arriving in person, demanding to take their children home. The camp's gravel parking lot filled with cars from across the region, engines idling as frantic parents packed up belongings. Some openly confronted staff in front of police, accusing them of negligence or worse. Others stood in tense silence, their eyes scanning the grounds as though trying to picture what had happened to Claire. For the camp director, the situation was spiraling out of control. The disappearance alone was enough to draw media attention, but the suggestion that members of the staff were under suspicion turned the story into a national headline. Local news crews stationed themselves just beyond the property line, cameras trained on the entrance, catching every vehicle that came and went. Each new report brought more questions and more public outrage. In private, the director confided to police that the camp's future was in jeopardy. Decades of carefully built reputation were unraveling in a matter of days. Enrollment inquiries for the next summer season had already been canceled. Sponsors and donors were backing away, and a few parents of current campers were threatening legal action. Yet behind all of that, the investigation remained stalled. Every staff interview seemed to raise more suspicions, but no one could be eliminated or definitively tied to the night Claire disappeared. By the end of the week, the atmosphere at the camp had shifted completely. Where there had once been music drifting across the grounds, there was now an oppressive quiet, broken only by the crunch of boots as search teams came and went. Inside the main office, investigators studied the same incomplete timelines again and again, knowing that somewhere among these people there could be someone who wasn't telling the truth, someone who might know exactly why a blind girl never made it back to her cabin. The tip came in during the third day of the search, just as investigators were beginning to feel the case hardening into a puzzle with too few pieces. A long-haul truck driver, passing through the area in the early hours of the morning, Claire vanished, called the sheriff's office after seeing news coverage. He said he believed he'd seen the missing girl, or someone who looked strikingly like her, standing at the edge of a 2-lane rural road about 4 miles from the camp. It was roughly 2 a.m., and she wasn't alone. Beside her, he recalled, was an adult man wearing a dark hoodie with the camp's logo printed across the front. The driver described the scene in careful detail. His headlights had picked them up from a distance. The girl had shoulder-length hair and was holding something close to her chest, though he couldn't be certain if it was a bag, an instrument, or nothing at all. She didn't appear to be trying to flag down traffic, and she wasn't dressed for the cool night air. The man beside her stood with his back partly turned toward the road, and as the truck passed, he placed a hand lightly on the girl's shoulder, guiding her a few steps away from the pavement. What unsettled the driver most was her posture. She wasn't moving, just standing there as though waiting for something. In his rearview mirror, he thought he saw the glow of taillights in the distance behind them, but by the time he rounded the bend, they were gone. At the time, he dismissed it as a strange but harmless scene. It wasn't until he saw Claire's picture on the news, the same hair, the same slight build, that he realized what he might have witnessed. Investigators treated the lead as urgent. The location the driver described sat near the service road connected to the camp, the same road where search dogs had lost Claire's scent. That detail was impossible to ignore. If the man in the hoodie was indeed a staff member, it meant someone with direct access to the camp may have been involved in moving her off the property. Within hours of receiving the tip, law enforcement launched a massive search along that stretch of road. Patrol cars moved slowly in both directions, sweeping their spotlights over ditches, tree lines, and gravel turnouts. Detectives canvassed nearby houses, asking residents if they'd seen anything unusual in the early morning hours. Roadside pull-offs were examined for signs of tire impressions, footprints, or discarded items. The effort yielded almost nothing. No tire tracks could be definitively linked to the night in question, and no personal belongings were found. Security cameras on nearby properties were scarce, and those few that existed either faced the wrong direction or had no recordings from that night. The absence of physical evidence frustrated investigators, but the witness's description carried enough credibility to keep the lead alive. They began comparing the man's clothing, a camp hoodie, to staff-issued apparel. Each summer, the camp provided several hoodies with the logo printed in white, given to both permanent staff and seasonal workers. That made it impossible to narrow the suspect pool to a single person, but it did reinforce the growing suspicion that whoever the man was, he wasn't an outsider who had stumbled across Claire by chance. Interviews with staff revealed nothing conclusive. Those questioned either denied leaving the grounds that night or claimed not to own a camp hoodie at all, though photographs and past camper posts on social media suggested otherwise. The maintenance worker, who had abruptly left the morning after her disappearance, remained a prime focus, but his location at 2 a.m. could not be confirmed. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted this was the first lead that felt like a possible turning point. If the sighting was real, if that girl truly was Claire, it suggested she had been alive and moving hours after she vanished from the path to her cabin. But it also meant she'd been taken away from the camp without resistance, either because she trusted the person she was with, or because she had no choice. As the search teams wrapped for the night, a detective lingered at the edge of the service road, looking out toward the dark strip of highway where the trucker claimed to have seen her. The distance between that point and the camp was short, barely a mile as the crow flies, yet in that span, something had happened to change the course of the investigation entirely, and the possibility that someone inside the camp had orchestrated it was becoming harder to dismiss. In the weeks that followed Claire's disappearance, the flurry of activity that had consumed the camp began to thin. What started as a rescue mission, full of urgency and belief that she might be found alive, slowly shifted into something more subdued, the grim work of a recovery effort. The national news crews that had once lined the gravel road leading to the camp pulled away to cover newer stories. Volunteers who had driven in from surrounding counties returned to their lives. By mid-August, the search perimeter had shrunk, and only the core investigative team and a few dedicated locals remained. The lake, which shimmered under the summer sun in the first days of the search, became a focal point for recovery crews. It stretched across the edge of the property, deceptively calm, its depths concealing tangles of weeds and uneven terrain. Divers worked in grids, pulling themselves through murky water clouded with silt, visibility often reduced to inches. Police boats dragged weighted lines along the bottom, bringing up branches, discarded fishing tackle, and debris from decades of camp activity. Each time something broke the surface, onlookers would hold their breath, but nothing linked to Claire ever emerged. Attention then turned to the outer reaches of the camp property. There were several old cabins scattered along forgotten trails, structures that hadn't been in use for years. Some had partially collapsed, their roofs caved in from heavy snowfalls of winters past. Others stood intact, but smelled of rot, their interiors layered with dust and the smell of mildew. Search teams moved through each one, documenting anything that might have been out of place. In one, they found a small camp bed with a blanket that looked newer than the rest of the furnishings, but forensic testing revealed nothing of value. In another, a single glass bottle sat on a windowsill, untouched for so long that moss had grown over the base. It was during one of these sweeps that an investigator came across a small lakeside storage shed tucked away behind thick brush. The shed was weathered and leaning slightly, its padlock rusted through. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and oil. Broken oars, tangled fishing line, and cracked life preservers were piled in a corner. As one of the team members walked across the floor, a faint crunching sound caught his attention. Wedged between two warped planks was a small amber-colored cake of rosin, the same type used to treat violin bows. The discovery immediately drew interest. Counselors confirmed that Claire had used that specific brand of rosin during her practices, something her parents had provided before she left home. But it was also a common brand, easily purchased in music stores. Investigators collected it carefully, logging it as evidence. They hoped fingerprints or trace DNA might confirm it had been hers, or at least connect it to someone who had handled her violin after she vanished. Weeks passed before the lab results returned, and when they did, the outcome was a blow. No usable fingerprints, no recoverable DNA. Without a direct forensic link, the rosin was reduced to a frustrating maybe, a possible clue with no way to prove its relevance. Some detectives argued it could have been in the shed for years, dropped by a camper long before Claire ever arrived. Others believed it was too specific and too close to the timeline to ignore. For the Hartman family, the lack of progress was crushing. They had stayed near the camp for as long as they could, attending daily briefings, walking the grounds themselves, and clinging to the hope that a break would come. But with the investigation stalling and the search efforts scaling back, they eventually returned home. Claire's bedroom remained exactly as it had been the day she left, the bed neatly made, sheet music stacked on her desk, her spare bow resting on a shelf. Her mother would later say that walking past that room was both a comfort and a wound. Comfort, because it kept Claire close. A wound, because it was a constant reminder that she should be there to fill it. And as the last of the summer warmth faded from the Adirondacks, the trail that had once seemed so urgent and fresh now felt cold, with only scattered fragments, a roadside sighting, a back door opened in the night, a piece of rosin in a forgotten shed, to suggest where a blind girl with a gift for music might have gone. By 2018, nearly 2 years after Claire Hartman vanished from the summer music camp in the Adirondacks, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. The once busy case file, thick with daily reports and promising leads, now rested in a metal cabinet drawer, pulled out only when a new tip came in. Most of what trickled through was useless, vague sightings hundreds of miles away, claims from psychics, and cruel hoaxes from people seeking attention. Each false lead drained resources and patience, eroding the momentum investigators had fought to maintain. For Claire's parents, especially her mother, letting the trail go cold was never an option. Grief had hardened into a quiet, determined fight. She began advocating for missing persons cases involving the visually impaired, reaching out to lawmakers, partnering with advocacy organizations, and speaking at conferences. Her message was simple but pointed. Investigations must adapt to the unique needs of each missing person. Blindness, she explained, didn't make her daughter helpless, but it did mean she navigated the world differently. Those differences mattered in an investigation, and ignoring them could cost precious time. Local media covered her advocacy in small bursts, often around the anniversary of Claire's disappearance. She used every opportunity to plead for information, urging anyone with even the smallest detail to come forward. Publicly, she was unwavering. Privately, she admitted to friends that she sometimes wondered if the world had simply moved on. The camp had shut down for 2 seasons after Claire's disappearance, eventually reopening under new ownership, but the surrounding community seemed to treat the case as a distant tragedy rather than an ongoing mystery. Then, in the summer of 2018, a former camper contacted the police. They had been at the camp the same year as Claire, or a couple of years older, and had never shared what they saw that night. They claimed they'd been sneaking out after curfew, something they admitted wasn't unusual for them, when they noticed a light moving through the woods beyond the cabins. At first, they assumed it was a counselor on patrol, but something about the movement didn't fit. The light was steady and low, held just above waist level, cutting through the darkness without sweeping back and forth like someone searching. It followed a clear path, deliberate and unhurried, weaving between the trees toward the deeper forest. The camper caught glimpses of a figure holding it, but the shadows obscured any details. No face, no clear outline, just the faint sense of a person guiding the light forward. They remembered pausing, listening for voices and hearing nothing. No laughter, no conversation, no footsteps other than those keeping pace with the light. The silence was unsettling. They thought they saw the faint shape of someone else walking a few steps ahead of the beam, but it was too dark to be sure. After a few moments, fear of being caught outside their cabin sent them retreating to bed. It wasn't until months later, when they learned the exact timeline of Claire's disappearance, that the memory began to haunt them. The path of that light, the purposeful movement away from camp, now seemed impossible to separate from what had happened to her. They had always assumed that if someone was walking with a camper, it was for a legitimate reason, an escort to the infirmary perhaps, or a late-night practice session. But now they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been something else entirely. Detectives took the account seriously. It was vague, but it matched aspects of a theory some had quietly entertained, that Claire may have been guided away from camp by someone she knew and trusted. Given her blindness, she relied heavily on sound and familiar cues. If the voice beside her was one she recognized, she might not have questioned where they were going until it was too late. The trouble was the time that had passed. 2 years later, the trail through those woods was gone. Weather, plant growth, and the changing seasons had erased any hope of finding physical traces along the route the camper described. Without another witness to confirm the sighting, it became just one more fragment of a larger, incomplete picture. Still, the new detail was added to the file. Investigators noted that the direction of the light's movement would have taken it toward the service road, the same road where Claire's scent trail had ended and where the truck driver claimed to have seen a girl matching her description with a man in a camp hoodie. It was a connection they couldn't prove, but one that deepened the suspicion that the person responsible had intimate knowledge of the camp's layout and its routines. For Claire's mother, the account was both a spark of hope and a new source of torment. If her daughter had been alive and walking that night, it meant there had been a chance to save her. It also meant someone had been with her, someone who hadn't come forward in the years since, someone who had chosen silence over truth. The seasons turned again, and the case remained officially cold. Each year brought fewer calls, fewer articles, fewer signs that the public still remembered the blind girl who vanished between the music hall and her cabin. But for one former camper, the image of that single flashlight beam moving steadily into the dark never left their mind. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic motion of a search. It was the quiet, confident pace of someone leading the way, and the haunting knowledge that Claire had never been seen again. By 2023, the camp had reopened under new management. The property had been renovated, the cabins repaired, and the lakefront restored to the polished image the brochures once promised. The new owners avoided direct mention of the events of 2016, though locals whispered about them to any outsider who would listen. For many in the area, the name of the camp still carried an unshakable shadow. That shadow deepened one quiet night in early autumn when the only staff on duty was a lone security guard making his rounds. The guard had been hired only a few months earlier and had no personal connection to the camp's history beyond what he'd overheard from locals. His shift was uneventful more often than not, a circuit of locked buildings, dim footpaths, and the occasional rustle of raccoons scavenging near the trash bins. That night, just after midnight, he was walking along the main trail that curved toward the lake when he heard it, faint, distant, and immediately out of place. It was violin music. The notes were thin but clear, rising above the gentle lap of water against the shore. They carried a strange, wavering quality, as though the player were far away and the sound was being pulled through the air unevenly. He stopped, listening. The melody wasn't familiar, but the tone was unmistakable. The warm, resin-rich sound of a wooden instrument. Following the direction of the music led him off the main path, down toward the overgrown edge of the lake where a weathered storage shed sat half hidden in the trees. When he reached the clearing, the music stopped. The shed's door was closed, the windows dark. He circled the structure, finding nothing but damp leaves and the smell of lake water. Convinced it must have been an echo from somewhere else on the property, perhaps a camper practicing late, he brushed it off and finished his shift. The following night, just after 1 a.m, the sound returned. This time it was softer, almost hesitant, the bow seeming to pause mid-phrase before continuing. Again, it came from the direction of the shed. The guard moved quickly down the trail, but just like the night before, the music ceased the moment he reached the clearing. Inside, the shed appeared as it had before, a forgotten space filled with rusted oars, cracked paddles, and mildewed life vests. No violin, no player. By the third night, curiosity had sharpened into unease. He decided to approach silently, keeping his flashlight off until he was close. The music began around the same time, the same slow, wavering tone. He crept toward the shed, careful not to crunch the gravel under his boots. As he reached the door, the music stopped. He pushed the door open. Inside, the clutter was undisturbed except for one object that hadn't been there before. Leaning against the far wall, illuminated by the pale spill of his flashlight, was an old violin. The wood was worn smooth at the chin rest, the varnish dulled by time, but it was intact. The bow rested across the strings as if someone had set it down only moments earlier. The guard didn't touch it. Instead, he called his supervisor, who contacted local law enforcement. Officers arrived and photographed the scene before collecting the violin for forensic testing. At first, there was speculation it might have been a prop left behind from years past. But when the results came back, the truth silenced the room. The serial number inside the body matched the records from Claire Hartman's violin, the same one she had taken to camp in 2016, the same one that had never been found. What unsettled investigators further was the condition of the instrument. It showed signs of recent use. The strings were tuned, the rosin on the bow fresh. There was no dust on the body, no cobwebs, nothing to suggest it had been sitting untouched for 7 years. Whoever had placed it in the shed had done so recently, and possibly only hours before the guard found it. The find reignited the case, drawing both media attention and renewed police interest. Detectives re-examined the original files, looking for anyone who might have had access to both the shed and the instrument. They combed through the camp's staff lists, cross-referencing them with old suspects. The shed had never been a focal point in the original search. Its location near the lake made it easy to overlook, and in 2016, it had been locked. For the Hartman family, the discovery was a blow of mixed emotions. The return of the violin meant that at least part of Claire's story was still out there, still being moved and handled by someone. But it also meant that for 7 years, whoever had it had chosen not to come forward. Someone had kept it hidden, and someone had played it. In the weeks that followed, the guard continued his night shifts, each one quieter than the last. He never heard the violin again. Yet every time he passed the shed, he felt the same tension in the air, the uneasy knowledge that, for 3 nights, the silence of the camp had been broken by music that shouldn't have been there, from an instrument that should never have been found in that place at all. When Claire's violin resurfaced in 2023, it was more than a piece of lost property. It was the first tangible evidence in years. Detectives treated it as if it were a crime scene unto itself. The instrument was taken directly to the state forensic lab, where every inch was examined under magnification. Technicians swabbed the neck, chin rest, tuning pegs, and even the inside of the body through the F-holes, hoping time hadn't erased whatever traces might still be there. Days later, the lab returned its findings. On the violin's neck and chin rest, both frequent points of contact for any player, they recovered a partial DNA profile. It belonged to an unknown male. The sample wasn't enough for a complete identification, too degraded to yield a full sequence, but it was clear that whoever had played or handled the instrument most recently was not in the national database. That ruled out any known offender already cataloged by law enforcement, but it didn't eliminate the possibility of someone tied to the camp. The forensic team also noted a deep, uneven scratch in the wood along the violin's upper bout. At first, investigators thought it was just damage from rough handling over the years. But when they consulted two experienced luthiers, both agreed the mark was unusual. It looked as though it had been made while the instrument was in use, perhaps when a player lost their bearings and the bow dragged hard against the edge. One luthier remarked that such a mark could happen if someone were playing in complete darkness, where even a skilled musician might misjudge their position. The idea carried an unsettling implication. If Claire's violin had been played after her disappearance, perhaps it had been done in a setting where light, and possibly freedom, was absent. Armed with the DNA results and the peculiar scratch, detectives reopened the case in full. The list of potential suspects was rebuilt from the ground up, starting with every staff member, seasonal worker, and contractor employed during the summer of 2016. One by one, they were tracked down and asked to submit fresh DNA samples for comparison. Most complied willingly, though several took weeks to respond, forcing detectives to push harder. During these renewed interviews, one former staff member, who had since moved out of state, admitted to something they had never shared in the original investigation. From the moment Claire disappeared, they said, they had quietly suspected a particular colleague, a maintenance worker who had only been employed for a short time and who left abruptly the very next morning. This was the same man linked to a previous line of inquiry years earlier, the one seen in the roadside tip from a truck driver, standing with a girl who matched Claire's description at 2 a.m. The staff member explained that the man's behavior in the days before the disappearance had been odd. He had been seen loitering near the music hall after hours and had taken solitary walks toward the service road, claiming he needed to check on equipment. On the night Claire vanished, his cabin light had been off unusually early, as though he'd gone to bed, but no one could confirm if he had actually been inside. When news of her disappearance spread the next morning, he didn't join the initial search and was gone before the state police had fully secured the camp. Detectives now saw the man as their most likely link between the roadside sighting and the violin's reappearance, yet locating him proved impossible. The address listed in his employment file was no longer valid, and neighbors at his last known residence claimed he had moved years earlier without leaving forwarding information. Old pay stubs and tax records hinted he had worked sporadically under different names, making the trail even harder to follow. National and regional law enforcement bulletins were updated with his information, and his DNA was flagged for comparison in any future arrest or sample submission. Still, months passed without a hit. Investigators were left with a frustrating truth. They had a likely suspect, a fresh piece of evidence, and a connection that tied the man to the last known movements of Claire Hartman, but no way to bring him in for questioning. For the Hartman family, the development was bittersweet. The violin's return, the partial DNA, and the resurfacing of old suspicions all hinted that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened. Yet the man they believed might hold the answers remained beyond reach. And as the case moved back into the slow rhythm of waiting for the next break, one detail lingered in the minds of those still working it. That deep, jagged scratch on the violin's body, an accidental signature left by hands that had no reason to be playing it in the dark at all. When the forensic testing was complete and the investigation hit another wall, the violin was formally released back to the Hartman family. It arrived in a sealed evidence bag, the wood still marked by the deep, uneven scratch and the faint scent of rosin. Claire's mother unwrapped it slowly, running her fingers along the curves of the instrument, the same way she had seen her daughter do countless times before. Holding it brought an ache sharper than she expected. It was a piece of her daughter's life, but not the one they needed most. The camp's new owners, who had inherited the property's reputation along with its buildings, kept their distance from the family out of respect. They had no involvement in the original case, but the land they now managed was tied to Claire's name in a way they could never erase. In the months after the violin was found, the owners began to share something with close staff, and eventually, quietly, with local law enforcement. On certain nights, usually well past midnight, faint violin music could be heard somewhere near the lake. It wasn't loud enough to pinpoint, more like a thin ribbon of sound that wove itself into the stillness. It didn't happen every night, and it didn't follow any pattern the staff could track. Some nights it was just a few notes, halting and uneven. Other times, it stretched into full phrases of music before vanishing into silence. The reports drew mixed reactions. Some in the community dismissed it as nothing more than local kids sneaking onto the property to stir up attention. Others believed something more unsettling, that whoever had taken Claire, or someone connected to her disappearance, was returning to the site. The theory gained traction when one groundskeeper claimed to have heard the music starting near the storage shed where the violin had been discovered, only for it to fade toward the tree line. The new owners increased nighttime patrols, adding extra security cameras around the property. But the music never coincided with any clear visual evidence. Cameras would record still water, unmoving trees, and empty paths while the faint sound carried through the air. Each time, by the time a guard reached the supposed source, there was nothing to find. For law enforcement, the phenomenon was frustrating. Without proof of a person physically being there, they could not tie the sounds to any suspect. Some officers suspected it was an intentional distraction, a way for someone to remind the camp, and perhaps the family, that they were still out there. Others wrote it off as a combination of wind, wildlife, and the power of suggestion. But the fact that the accounts came from multiple unrelated witnesses over several months kept the reports in the active file. For Claire's mother, the idea of the music was something else entirely. To her, it wasn't a ghost story or a campfire legend. She didn't believe her daughter's presence lingered in some spectral way. She believed the music meant there was still a living connection. Whether it was Claire herself or someone who knew where she was, it was proof that the story wasn't over. She refused to treat the sound as an omen. Instead, she saw it as a signal, faint but deliberate, that her daughter might still be out there, waiting to be found. She began visiting the camp more often, always choosing the quietest nights, sometimes walking the perimeter of the lake long after the gates were closed. On those visits, she'd pause at the shed where the violin was found, listening for anything in the stillness. Most nights brought only the ordinary sounds of the Adirondacks, water shifting against the shore, an owl calling from somewhere in the treetops. But every so often, when the wind was low and the air seemed to hold itself still, she swore she could hear it, the faint, unmistakable voice of strings carrying just far enough to remind her that her daughter's case was not finished. Officially, the investigation remains unsolved. Claire's name is preserved in the state's cold. Case files, her photograph stored alongside the hundreds of other faces still waiting for resolution. Theories continue to circle: abduction, runaway, even the possibility that she was hidden in the area longer than anyone realized. But no theory has brought answers. For the people who live near the camp, the legend of the music has become part of the property's identity. To some, it's nothing more than a camp myth designed to keep the memory alive. To others, it's a warning that whoever was responsible for 2016 never truly left. But for one family, and especially for one mother, the faint sound of a violin in the distance isn't about fear or folklore. It's a thread of hope, stretched thin but unbroken, a reminder that as long as the music plays, the story isn't over.